Welcome to TWIL and another COVID-19 law and policy briefing produced by Public Health Law Watch, a George Consortium initiative housed at Northeastern University School of Law. Thank you to our co-sponsors, the Center for Public Health Law Research at Temple University, the Network for Public Health Law, Change Lab Solutions, and the APHA Law Section. I'm Nicolas, professor at Indiana University McKinney School of Law. With all of your free time in between the various European matches, please check out our reports assessing legal responses to COVID-19, available at publichealthwatch.org. On Twitter, please use the hashtag COVID Law Briefing for any questions or comments in response to this episode. Joining me today are Professor Anniek de Ruijter, Professor of European Law at the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands, Professor Andrew Noymer from the University of California Irvine, and Professor Nils Hoppa from the Faculty for Humanities and SocialSciences at Leibniz University in Hannover, Germany. So Nils and Anniek, when we last spoke, which was in early December 2020, we knew we had a regime change in the US, subject to any insurrections, of course, and that the process of giving emergency approvals to the various vaccines had begun in the US and the UK. We're also seeing the first tragic implications of the winter surge, but we did not at that time know of the Alpha variant, which was discovered in the UK just before Christmas. To give further context to today's discussion about international issues, England just delayed its reopening because of the Delta variant. The G7 meeting just concluded with our leaders promising 1 billion COVID vaccine doses for poorer nations, while our borders exist in a colorful range of red, orange, or green travel restrictions, even as Euro 2020, delayed a year to enable the fine-tuning of England's all-conquering team, has begun, and we're only 6 weeks away from the Tokyo Olympics opening ceremony. It's almost 18 months since the start of the pandemic, and the US just passed 600,000 lives lost. The European WHO region is closing in on 3 million. From a public health and or law and policy perspective, what have we learned? Are we smarter, better informed about airborne contagion? Do we have a better sense of what can be expected of our fellow citizens and what our public health and legal systems can actually achieve? So with that thought, Andrew, one of your recent tweets was rather pithy. Memo to the IOC, the health of 125 million Japanese citizens is more important than your Olympiad. Almost 18 months into the pandemic, can our institutions still operate with such a sort of binary on-off switch, Andrew?
Thank you. It's a challenge. And I tweeted that because I was seeing a lot of traffic about how, they're doing this to protect the athletes, they're doing that to protect the athletes, and the athletes are going to be tested, 3 times a week. And, it's really losing sight of the forest for the trees. I mean, there's going to be people coming to Tokyo from all over the world, including countries that are currently in the throes of, the worst phase of the pandemic, even though here in the United States, we're currently in a more lenient period. And I just thought, the Olympics were canceled during the World Wars, and this is an event that is killing people comparable to a World War, as you pointed out, Nick, in the introduction. So, why can't the 2020, now 2021 Olympics simply be, canceled? And, the answer is, of course, that there's a lot of money at stake, among other things. So, I think our modern, our 21st century institutions are ill-poised to deal with the pandemic. It's become completely politicized, and not just in the United States, but everywhere. And I do worry about our ability to deal with, the next pandemic.
So Anniek, to an extent, I see the Olympics issue as sort of a group of people in European, I guess it's in IOC headquarters somewhere in Europe, making decisions for another country, essentially. In a new paper, you use the access to COVID medicines, particularly joint procurement, as a sort of frame to examine the current state of European health solidarity. It's a great paper. I put a link in the show notes. It's a complex one, and maybe you could just sort of share a couple of top level insights with us, or anything else you'd like to say with regard to this topic.
Yeah, so I was already doing research in health emergencies and the EU, because I thought emergencies are an important site for potential further EU integration. And EU integration in the field of health, and that means so basically harmonizing national health laws, is very difficult, because health is such an issue of taxes that are being paid, an issue of solidarity, many great differences with respect to ethics and other very politically sensitive aspects. And so, and solidarity, of course, in the EU in the field of health is very important, because all of the systems work based on universal access to healthcare. And so the way that access to healthcare is being rationed, etc., very political as well. So what does it mean if the EU now increasingly has power in this area? Now, I thought access to emergency vaccines was an important site for looking at that. What would citizens, would they agree with sharing emergency vaccines, and would they agree with, and what type of laws would they agree with? And so this was the premise that we had when we first started researching before COVID, and fielding this large surveys across the EU in 5 different countries on what kind of laws and policies would you agree with in case of an emergency if it came down to sharing vaccines. And then while we were fielding that research, COVID happened. So we were very much confused for a little while on what to do. Do we stop the research? Do we go on, et cetera? And anyway, lots of decisions, but we decided to go on with this research. And actually, we looked at to what extent, basically what we wanted to know, how solidary are European citizens? Do we want to share when, in case, there is a large demand for vaccines, would they want to share with other EU citizens? So do I, as a Dutch person, want to share my vaccines? Do I feel solidary with the French or not? That's basically what we asked. And what came out is that Europeans are quite solidary. So it's not necessarily a matter of citizens not wanting these types of legal arrangements for solidarity. It's mostly a political issue. So it's the difficulty lies at the political level. And citizens were quite accepting of these types of solidarity arrangements. So this is, I think, important insights for policymakers, that in case they want to create more EU integration on joint procurement, so buying vaccines together, but also distributing these vaccines across the European continent, that at least from the perspective of citizens, this type of law would be acceptable.
So when we spoke last, we reflected, didn't we, on the sort of rather knee-jerk response of some EU countries immediately closing borders against the very spirit of the Union. Are we to think that perhaps that's less likely now? Is that one of the lessons we've learned?
Totally. So actually yesterday, the European Commission came out with 10 lessons learned from the pandemic. Now, to have an emergency system for when borders need to be closed, or when quick decisions need to be made for this at the level of the member states or at the level of the Union, that was one of the first things that was on these 10 lessons learned. We need to do this better next time, more coordinated, etc. So I'm sure that there will be some new laws and regulations to prevent this type of situation from happening again in the future. Yeah.
So to you, Niels, after the delay of the English unlocking, everyone's favorite British newspaper, The Sun, asked, quote, "Will we ever be free?" How prevalent is that sentiment in Europe? Have national legal systems weighed in on these kinds of freedom issues, as increasingly we've seen both in lawsuits and also in political turmoil in US states?
Well, first of all, I think it's very charitable of you to call The Sun a newspaper, but I'll leave that there. The whole language that's being used in the UK around this, Freedom Day and things like that, at least from the German perspective, is being seen very much as the UK government cosplaying 1944 in lots of its rhetoric, and it's being seen as rather tedious. At the same time, if you look at legal systems and the mechanisms that they've used, obviously the main mechanism that we've seen in the last 18 months has been one of restricting freedoms, left, right, and center. So the question isn't so much, I think, have legal systems weighed in? They have, but they've weighed in on the negative side. The question is then, how has the population responded in terms of lawsuits against these restrictions of freedoms? And you asked me this question the last time, and I got some updated figures in relation to that question, in relation to Germany. So these are from March 2020. And the German national broadcaster ZDF did a survey of judicial reviews in relation to the freedom restricting mechanisms that were being deployed in the different individual states in Germany. And they recorded 9,951 judicial reviews, individual judicial reviews. They had a response rate of nearly 60 courts across the country, administrative courts. And there are always peaks at the times when new measures came in. So in April, May last year, in November last year, that's when the main peaks of judicial reviews came in, which isn't very surprising, because if there is a measure that you disagree with, then it's a good idea to issue a claim as quickly as possible and not wait for too long. So from the lawyer's perspective, that isn't a surprising finding. The surprising finding is that the success rate of these judicial reviews has been very low, between 2 and 10%. In relation to these measures. It's been higher in one particular part of this, and that's the restricting the right to demonstrate and to assemble in public. Those were the rights where the success rates of judicial reviews were around 40% plus. So this is where the courts looked specifically at things such as proportionality, explainability, foreseeability of measures, the length or duration of the measures, and so on. So I think that's where the courts actually did start to correct some of the measures that the individual legal systems produce. This is obviously only a snapshot of Germany, but my intuition would be that we would have similar types of judicial review across the European continent. And going back to your initial question, what have we learned? The last time we met and talked about this, we were talking about regimes, and I use that word consciously, in the UK, in the US, in Brazil, that were particularly hard hit by this pandemic. And one uniting characteristic that these countries had at the time was a policy of national exceptionalism. And I think the one thing that we have learned from this at this point is we're not all going to be safe until we're all safe. And that means we have to stop thinking about getting the vaccines only for our populations. We have to roll them out big style across the world to ensure that the virus has nowhere to go to mutate and to produce new challenges.
So when we did talk before about public health measures and the legal system, the context was primarily with regard to issues such as mask mandates, stay-at-home orders, social distancing. Since then, as the vaccines, at least in some countries, have increased in number, we're seeing new issues come up, new public health law issues coming up, such as things like vaccine passports. And in the US, there was apparently great enthusiasm at the federal government level for these early on, before the politics kicked in and everyone backed away. And in fact, we're even seeing some US states enacting rules banning the use of so-called vaccine passports, creating problems, for example, for cruises that want to dock in Florida, that have mandated the use of these passports or other sort of vaccine requirements. So, Andrew, starting with you, these kinds of things, whether you like to call them passports or not, mandatory testing and so on, are these just temporary artifacts, or is this part of the new normal going forward?
Well, that's really the one of the key questions. I mean, and you mentioned the choice of term there. I do not like the term vaccine passport, and we're seeing here in Orange County, California, the sixth most populous county in the United States, we're seeing very low vaccine uptake in Latino men, and I think passport is an utterly insane choice of word for a document that has nothing to do with crossing an international frontier, and we're in a country in which you have a large immigrant population, which is often marginalized. And so use of the term passport is just a complete, it's just the latest in the series of blunders that the United States has done. As we've seen with so-called social distancing, once you start using a term, it just sticks. It's not social distancing; it's physical distancing. But good luck, trying to talk about that. As far as we live in the 21st century now. This is not the 1918 pandemic, and I think businesses that wish to have a vaccine requirement, or places of employment that wish to have a vaccine requirement, can do so legally, probably from a public health point of view, should do so. And they are entitled to verify in their customers or in their employees that vaccination has happened, and to do so beyond the honor system in most cases. I'm very cautious about creating a new electronic record on all of us. I think it needs to be, it may need to be done, but it needs to be done with care. In Philadelphia, there was a contact tracing database that was hacked. Why would anyone want to hack a contact tracing database? I don't know. Why would anyone care if person A, said that they spent time with person B? Why is that sensitive? Well, it turns out that they added to this contact tracing database sexual orientation data. Why did they do that? Well, it's not the best idea, but they did it because out of the desire to make sure that that people, from all the sexual groups were included. And so now it was hacked, and that is now sensitive information that is out, in the dark web or whatever the hackers did with it. So I'm worried about creating some sort of electronic vaccine passport that's going to be a magnet for other unrelated health data that will be linked to us personally, and then will be a target for hackers. So, I'm really of two minds on the vaccine passports. I mean, I do think institutions are entitled to say, you need to be vaccinated, and I want proof that you're vaccinated, and I want proof beyond the honor system, and your little cardboard, vaccine card is impractical. But but we need to be very cautious that we're not creating a backdoor into our complete medical record through some sort of linkage that is then hacked, and then all of a sudden all our sensitive health information is just out in the open. So it's quite frankly, Nick, a mess as far as I'm concerned.
So the responsible US agencies have recently issued guidance for employers, for example, saying that it is lawful, with some medical exception carve-outs, it is lawful to require vaccines. Is that roughly what's going on in Europe as far as as people return to work?
Yeah, so there are discussions, similar discussions in Europe on all this. And I do think it's one of these, we talk a lot about the resilience of health systems, et cetera, but also let's not forget about the resilience of the rule of law, the resilience of law in this case. And I do think freedom should be the rule, and infringements on freedom should be the exception to that rule. And it seems right now that I think, I mean, to see the research by Nils saying that we've seen mostly legal cases on the right to demonstrate, which is to me a last straw that citizens have to protect their rights. And it really isn't, I mean, it's not like once you've had a demonstration, then that's going to solve all your problems. So I do think that indeed what Andrew said as well, the basis of public health is trust, right? Because and it seems right now that because if people don't share their health issues, that they're sick, that is basically the end of any public health system. So if we start treating all citizens like criminals, you know, I'm over exaggerating, but just to make the point, it's going to be the end of our public health system. Nobody, so the rule of the protection of the rule of law and the protection of freedom aligns with wanting to protect public health. These things are not opposite goals, right? And so I feel like we're going very fast with a lot of these measures. And I feel like I would like to see a lot more legal cases. And I would like to see this discussion that we would have this discussion on this basis, not saying, but also how can we serve public health through law and through protecting laws and through protecting freedoms, because that is actually a public health measure. And so I think that it is important that we see more of these legal cases going into court, lawyers asking these questions, citizens asking these questions, because I think it's a huge discussion and we haven't started it even.
So do you think, maybe coming to you, Niels, that public health sort of overplayed its hand this time, that it thought it could do a lot more than it actually could, and that the measures that were introduced were just too restrictive, allowed for politicization in some countries at least, and also sort of led to the just everyone was so over both the pandemic and the restrictions, the fatigue?
I think that the phenomenon that you're describing was part of public health by birth. Public health has always been part of a spectrum of things such as national security that carved out exceptions and certain norms that allowed states to derogate from very fundamental rights on the basis of public health. So it's always been there. It's just that we've as a society been really lucky for about 100 years that we haven't been in this situation, that we had to derogate from very, very fundamental rights on the basis of health. I want to agree with what Andrew said earlier. I think the term passport in the context of requiring people to provide proof of their health status, the word passport is clearly a word that was coined in this context by privileged people for whom the word passport connotates freedom and nice things, and not for people for whom this is a threat to their livelihood. So that's wholly the wrong word entirely, and I do agree. At the same time, we do need some sort of system by which we can tell those who are safe and have taken the vaccine from people who have elected not to, so we can create specific measures for people who have elected not to. And those measures may include protecting them in a different way in order to give effect to their right not to take a medical intervention that they disagree with. We still have that. That hasn't entirely disappeared. But in order to make those rules, make those exceptions for those types of people, we need to know who they are. But we need to do that in a finely balanced and very sensitive way. And the paper passports, the paper passes, the paper proofs of vaccination that we have certainly don't come up to scratch in that regard. They're easily forged. And we're having huge conversations in Germany about forgeries of these. And that's why we've started introducing electronic means of doing this. And inevitably, because Germany isn't the most advanced country when it comes to digitalization, we're going to get this very, very wrong. And there's going to be a terrible public debate about it. But a lot of the public debate in relation to having to prove your vaccination status reminds me of that Twitter account, Bad Legal Takes, that you must be aware of, which is people are saying, well, this must be unconstitutional to require me to prove my vaccination status. We've had that system in place and it's been constitutionally tested for decades. When kids go to daycare, you show that they've been inoculated against measles. You can take that through different professions. You can say in certain professions where you have close contact with vulnerable populations, your employer can ask you to be vaccinated or not take that job. So we've had these measures, they have been tested in different contexts, and you don't have to be a medical lawyer to find the analogies between these different contexts. And then just finally, before I've waffled on for too long, in terms of the original question in relation to public health. Public health has always had this kind of this feeling of wrapping something that sounds like it's an individual right into a right of the many. Think of medical confidentiality. The whole of medical confidentiality is a public health measure. It's got nothing to do with informational self-determination of an individual. It's got something to do with encouraging people to share their health information with the right people in order to protect the many. And we're at exactly the same point, just in a slightly different context. So it's important to not lose sight of that.
So I think as we look back, it's become quite clear that during the terrible mismanagement in the US, and I think you could make similar arguments about the UK, particularly some of the stuff that's coming out about the herd immunity issues and so on, that the US and the UK made a bet, and it was a long odds bet, but they won, right? The vaccines worked and worked spectacularly. We got really lucky. And our numbers, although awful, have fallen off the cliff recently. A few weeks ago, every US newspaper had like a headline about what was going on in India, Nepal a little bit later, the Brazilian situation, obviously extraordinary, and some reporting about what was going on in sub-Saharan Africa. Those have sort of fallen off our front pages. And I wondered what, particularly, I guess, from what we saw at the G7, what is going to be the solidarity response of the West to dealing with millions, billions of persons who are at risk that don't have their own national sort of luck of having sort of the native vaccine, although of course India has a tremendous vaccine production capability, but that's been badly hobbled.
Well, I mean, Nick, your question really goes to the heart of what the next 24 months are going to look like. I mean, this is going to be a long pandemic. It already is a long pandemic. We're in the second pandemic summer here in the Northern Hemisphere. Let me remind the viewers that in 1918, the summer of 1918 was kind of a quiescent period, and the summer of 1919, the pandemic was over. So, this is not just a replay of the 1918 influenza. And, the other thing that American newspapers have been talking about is herd immunity, without always understanding what that means. There is no herd immunity without international cooperation. The very beginnings of our understanding of in the science of epidemiology of what herd immunity is began in many ways with Panam's studies in the 19th century of measles outbreaks in the Faroe Islands, in which he discovered that measles went extinct in the Faroe Islands, only to be reintroduced, only to go extinct again, only to be reintroduced. The Faroe Islands were back then isolated. There was, sailing, but with literal sails was the only way to reach there. And, they would achieve a state of herd immunity from measles, and it would go away, but it would be reintroduced, and the process would repeat itself. Today we have travel all over the world through airplanes. We can achieve herd immunity, as misunderstood as that is, in the United States or in wherever. But as long as there's communication of people worldwide, we're going to have a problem. And we talked about variants a little bit earlier in the pod. It is so important that we have international cooperation to vaccinate not just the United States and other countries that were early adopters. And you're right. I mean, the United States, gambled and won. We placed an all-in bet on a single strategy, and we drew a royal flush. And that's basically what happened. But you can't argue with success, I guess. So, but we need more international cooperation. We need to vaccinate everyone, or else we're never going to achieve meaningful herd immunity anywhere.
Anniek, we have had discussions about intellectual property issues here. Are those issues sort of relatively ephemeral and will disappear, or are those legal structures really major barriers to increasing our outreach to other countries?
Yeah, so I'm not an intellectual property expert or anything like that, but I do think that what was now decided at the G7 is, of course, not really what one would like to see, because it is kind of denigrating in a way. You give away a bunch of the vaccines you probably don't need anymore, and you don't allow people to make their own vaccines, and also to then use that to create an infrastructure. Because it's not just yeah. So I think that discussion will not die down. I think right now we had the unfortunate situation of the Germans in Europe really not wanting to budge on this. So politically, this was a no-go. I mean, I still think it's a no-go, and the pressure is, if you just hold on long enough, time will help you politically. So I think right now I don't see so much in the newspapers about it anymore. So, but I do think this discussion will come back and will be more easy in the abstract. So I think when we now see that there's going to be a discussion about a pandemic treaty and all of these things are being rehashed and rediscussed, then I think there is a potential for creating some kind of mechanism for when this happens in the future. But then it's an abstract, legal, political debate. And that will be easier, I think, rather than having invested so much already. And yeah.
So Nils, feel free to comment on that and the German position, but also let's begin sort of our final round of questions. And we started by talking about lessons learned. What happens this winter? When we all leave the healthy outdoors and once again huddle in front of Netflix, offices call back their employees, our schools and universities return in person. I'm returning to the classroom. Our university had a vaccine mandate, and it will be interesting. But what happens in the winter, Nils? You're first up.
Right, I'll say, if I may, I'll say a little bit about the intellectual property issue in just a moment, but just to answer your question, I had an email today from my university telling me to prepare for an in-person teaching semester come the autumn and the winter. And if I've learned one thing in the last 18 months, that I try not to speculate too much because it always ends up being slightly different. But the one trajectory that we may be able to see is that we're getting this wrong every single time. And I think that goes back to our conversation we've had about vaccinating the world and making sure that as many people as possible have access to vaccines, because there are going to be more mutations. And at the moment, it seems that we're lucky in the sense that the alpha and the delta mutations are still something that can be fended off using the vaccines that we have. They're still efficient and effective to a certain extent. There will inevitably be, unless we vaccinate everyone, a mutation which is going to circumnavigate the vaccine protection that we have developed. And maybe as a small side note, we've heard the word luck and royal flush a couple of times now in relation to where we are. That's not all luck. Yeah, I think we shouldn't take too much away from team science here. As a global scientific community, we've really done incredible things in the shortest amount of time, taking massive risks as well along the way, and we mustn't forget that. But it's not just luck. There's also a lot of science involved that we spend decades and centuries developing. And this maybe leads on to the point on intellectual property. I might sort of just slightly and respectfully disagree with this idea that unlocking the patents to the rest of the world and allowing them to produce their own compounds, their own vaccines, is actually going to solve the problem. It may seem attractive at this point to do so, but I think the German position very much hinges on the fact that there's a long-term strategy behind it. And that is, what about the next pandemic? If we can't find the BioNTechs and the Pfizers and all of the other big companies that make their money based on patent exploitation downstream to underpin and underwrite and finance these types of developments. And I'm not going to go into the tedious sums that we all know, the 1 billion euros it costs to get something from bench to bedside and so on. But we're talking about a huge amount of private investment and private know-how that goes into development of these types of things. And that played a role in how lucky we were in developing this in 12 months. And if we now take away the one thing that actually we have established in the past, and that's where the error may lie in our ways, the one thing we've established in the past that incentivizes this by giving them a return on investment through intellectual property mechanisms, then I think we may actually be shooting ourselves in the foot for the next time that we need the pharmaceutical industry to help us with this. So the answer may not lie in some sort of TRIPS-based compulsory licensing threat over the pharmaceutical industry. The solution may lie in the nationalization of the purchasing of vaccines rather than the nationalization of the production of vaccines. So I'm not entirely convinced yet that giving up the patent protection for these vaccines is actually the answer.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the next, I mean, what should we focus on in the future? When it comes to these issues, it's not only vaccines, it's emergency vaccines, but also antibiotics. So there are some of these medicines that are basically they're public goods. And I don't see how, I mean, I'm sure there should always be public-private partnerships and things like that. But who should be in the lead on this? And in the next 50 years, if we run out of antibiotics, are we really going to leave that to the private industry? I mean,
are you back in the classroom in October?
To who's that addressed?
I was actually asking Anniek, but
oh yes. I hope so. I very much enjoy direct interaction with students. So yes, I hope so.
Excellent. All right, Andrew, last word to you.
Yeah.
What happens this winter?
Well, I mean, it's true that it's not pure luck that the way the vaccines work, that there's a lot of science that went into that. I am back in the classroom in the fall, and I'm looking forward to it. And at least at first, I'm not apprehensive about it because I'm vaccinated and I have seen the vaccine data and it works. And but this is. I've always said, and the viewers can trawl through my old tweets about this subject. Going back to February of 2020, I said there was going to be sort of like a chaotic phase, and then it was going to become a seasonal phenomenon. And so we're leaving the chaotic phase, and it's becoming a winter-dominant seasonal phenomenon, like influenza. Of course, the tropics are somewhat different, but we're going to have more COVID next winter in the United States than in Europe, full stop. And hopefully that yet another variant won't be mixed in there, and hopefully, although this is sort of may sound naive, that the states will catch up to one another in terms of vaccination rates over the summer. Well, it sort of doesn't really matter if you're still at 20% vaccination because the transmission is very low right now, and hopefully by September, all 50 United States will be at 85% vaccination. I don't think that will come to pass, but so I mean, this is going to become a seasonal phenomenon. There's going to be COVID in the wintertime for decades, probably increasingly mild as time wears on. But winter is going to be interesting. And the other thing that is going to be a huge and hugely contentious topic is going to be vaccination for people under the age of 12.
So, as the phrase goes, winter is coming. Well, thank you to my guests, and thank you to all of you for watching or listening today. The recordings are available on the Public Health Law Watch website and are archived by the Week in Health Law podcast at twill.com. We'll see you next time. Please get vaccinated when you can, and please stay safe.